All right, so this is a continuation of our conversation with John Morehead. I know that some of us had questions, so John agreed to have a real quick. Just I'm gonna throw these questions at you, and you can do what you want with them. But I think
Okay.
suffice to say, we were very curious and interested in kind of your approach and learning to be a good witness to our neighbors by listening. But one of the questions was, have you ever felt a sense of spookiness or of potentially having other like spiritual presences? I think people are thinking about like demonic forces or things like that. With when you're dialoguing with others or when you're with other people, and this is related to that. How do you guard your heart when you're talking to people of different religious persuasions, so that you don't end up being persuaded away from the truth?
Yeah, two different questions there. I'll take the first one first, and that is I haven't felt spookiness. I know Christians do, and I would encourage us to be sensitive to that. However, I would also encourage us to be careful, because a lot of times what we think might be warning about spiritual danger is really our apprehension and our fears. So, for example, I remember when I was in seminary here in Utah, where we have a high Mormon population. We've had some folks who came to the seminary, and they said when they drove from another state, came into Utah, they felt a real sense of spiritual oppression. But then as they were driving away and got into Idaho, they felt it lift. The fascinating thing is, in terms of per capita population, Idaho actually has a higher concentration of Mormons than Utah does. So in other words, if there really was a sense of spiritual oppression simply because they were around Mormons, then they should have felt it in Idaho just like they did in Utah. So in my opinion, it's really more of their own fears. When I was going overseas to Australia to go to New Age festivals, I know the church that sent me, the commissioning church, prayed for me because of the fears of where I was going into a New Age festival. But I have to say that I actually felt the Spirit of God even in a New Age festival. I think there are no-go places for God, even though there tend to be a lot of no-go places for us Christians. So be sensitive to the spiritual element that goes on, but let's be careful not to mistake our fears for any kind of spiritual oppression that's going on. What was the second question again?
Well, how do you guard your heart so that you don't end up, naively being like, are you just being foolhardy to go and just explore everything? And like, what if you end up being persuaded away from the truth? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I will say we have to recognize, and this is why some conservative Christians don't like engaging in dialogue on these kinds of things. There is an element of risk. And if you want to stay completely risk-free, then you don't talk to anybody. But I think there's a risk inherent in the Christian life and in discipleship. There's the parable of the talents that my colleague Terry Muck, who has done a lot of dialogue with the Buddhist community, is something of my mentor. He draws upon the parable of the talents. And if you recall that parable, that they were given a certain number of talents and they had to choose what to do with it. And to make a long parable short, I will say that at the end of the parable, it was the one who risked investing the talent, not the one who buried it in the ground, who was rewarded. So there is a risk to investment in others, but we simply need to be well grounded in our own faith and be curious. And if any questions come up as a result of your conversation, and you simply seek answers to them. I will say that statistically, very few people actually end up changing religious traditions as a result of dialogue, but it does happen in a small number of cases. But just be well grounded in the process.
And love always risks, right? I mean, there's got to be some level of risk involved in love, or else it's just a formula, and then people...
Any relationship is risky. I mean, you take a risk in a romantic relationship. So it's just being willing to take the risk on it for the rewards that God can provide.
Okay, so how about this one? I think we had some questions surrounding kind of like the idea of hard truths. So like you were talking a lot about like dialoguing, listening, and trying to understand where people are coming from and not unintentionally mislead people away from Jesus. Like, but you have to know how to be sensitive to where people are. But I think people wanted to bring in an opposite angle, like prophetic instincts speak the hard truth. I'm just going to throw some of these questions. They might be related to each other, might seem separate. have you ever felt called to say a hard truth to someone of another religious tradition? If so, how did that go? How do you know when you have a strong enough relationship with someone so that you can share those kinds of hard truths? And there's another related one is, do you ever feel the urge to water down the gospel instead of saying something that might be offensive to other people? Yeah, we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's always the fear again, that there will be compromise, which is why a lot of evangelicals don't like getting involved in this. I don't think I compromise. I think that we have to, in this process, share convictions and truths with people that they're not going to want to hear. And we need to, it's not a matter so much of do we do it, it's how we do it. And a lot of times we think that unless we're really hammering somebody with the truth of the gospel, that we're not doing it right. I've been participating for a few years now, before the pandemic, in a series of Mormon evangelical dialogues in Portland with our mutual friend, Paul Lewis Metzger at Multnomah University. And there's a scholar from BYU. What's that?
Paul actually came and shared with us.
Okay.
I mean, he was just talking about this idea of sacred time and the Christian calendar. He shared with us at the beginning of the year, so in January. So
yeah. So Paul and I are the evangelicals in this dialogue, and we've got a couple of Mormon counterparts, and we share things where we have deep differences in front of an audience to let them. We try to model how this can be done. We're not the experts, we're not the talking heads. We want people to see this and do it in their own neighborhoods, in their own homes, and that kind of thing. And that involves sometimes sharing difficult truths. And it goes both ways. I want the freedom, because of the relationship, to share something that I feel with conviction that my conversation partner may not necessarily agree with or like to hear. And I want them to say the same thing. So for example, I want the Mormon to feel free to tell me that they believe that the form of Christianity I hold to was in fact a form of apostate Christianity that was distorted by false teachers shortly after the disciples and was restored by Joseph Smith Jr. And I want the freedom to say, I think all of that is completely wrong-headed, unhistorical, and misguided. And we need to have the freedom to share those things in a relationship, but it's how one goes about sharing that. And when you do that, then you don't have to worry about watering down the gospel or anything like that.
Would you say it's kind of like, I mean, you know, when they talk about the trash bank, you want to build good vibes. So if you say something that is, you know, if there's the tension, the relationship is strong enough that the tension between doesn't just tear you apart and make you into we hate each other, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's the key. Is again, I want to focus on relationships. It's not just about we again, evangelicals we're about doctrine, worldview, ideas, the abstract, which is fine, but those things are held by people in their lives. I don't believe there is such a thing as Mormonism or Buddhism or Christianity out there in the ether. These are religious faiths lived by millions and billions of people. So what does it look like to have a relationship with somebody who's living out a religious tradition and allow them to speak how that's meaningful to them, how yours is meaningful to you, what the commonalities and differences are. And it comes down to the relationship. And the deeper the relationship and trust, the more freedom there is. Just like I said at the beginning, a romantic relationship. You wouldn't start out on your first date by grilling, hopefully, your date partner about all the things that you don't like about them or where you might disagree. But over time, you build a relationship and trust and the things you hold in common, and the areas where you disagree, it becomes easier to navigate those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of what another one of our speakers was sharing, just kind of like, we go in the confidence that God goes before us and with us. And so we're just trying to represent Jesus, not even just in our ideas that we share, but just in who we are. And, you know, we want, at the end of the day, to be a means by which people fall in love with Jesus, right? That's like, we want people to have their hearts awakened to love the Lord in the same way we do. And you don't get people to love someone by being like, well, let me list off all the 10 things that are amazing about Jesus. This is the reasons why you should love Jesus. And those that could be a part of, like you're saying, it's the way you do it, right? Because you throw evidence in someone's face that's different than you can say the same things in a different way, right? It's like, if you're trying to help someone fall in love with Jesus, man, this is these are the realities of Jesus. He's done this. He's, you know, he cares for people like this. This is what makes my heart. This is what makes Jesus true and real, and but also someone utterly fascinating, you know. And it's like painting a beautiful picture versus throwing a truth bomb at someone, right?
Right, right.
And you can
Yeah.
same truths, and you can either throw the bomb at them or you can draw people in. I don't know if
Yeah,
that's
yeah, I like that, the truth bomb. I think we evangelicals are really good at so-called truth grenades, right? I did a blog post years and years ago when I was in seminary, sharing my concerns of the idea of doctrine over person. That is, we're so concerned with truth with a capital T that we often lose sight of the person and the personal element. I want to win the person, and if it means on occasion I might be a little more gentle in my argument, then that's the approach that I'll take. We can win the battle, we think, by giving a good argument and really defeating and stomping somebody's ideas. But if we lose the person, then we've really lost sight of the whole purpose of why we're doing this.
and it sounds like because you were sharing about your journey when you used to this counter cult apologetics. Do you feel like you did that? You did lose a lot of people, and when you made this switch towards this different approach, multi-faith kind of listening and kind of dialoguing, do you feel like you see more of progress?
Well, it depends upon how you define progress. I mean, for me, success is not determined by necessarily winning an argument or seeing a convert. It's a faithfulness to a process. And I think we as evangelicals define success. It's by a body count. And one of the criticism I got as I left the counter cult community was, well, how many converts do you see? Because we see lots. And I really doubt that claim, because I observed for quite some time the approach that they were using. After I moved to Utah, Mormon culture, at least they used to, I think the Mormon church has stopped this. They used to have pageants. They're big into the arts. And so they would have these outdoor pageants, which is music and drama that reenacts portions of the Book of Mormon. And I went to Manti, a community up on the mountains where they have this annual pageant, the Book of Mormon pageant. And I was struck by how sacred it was and how well received it was by the Mormon community. And yet you would have a small number of evangelicals who would drive out and stand just on the outside of their property, hold up signs that would say Joseph Smith lied, shout sermons on bullhorns about Joseph Smith having many wives and this kind of thing. And the reaction of Mormons more often than not was anger. In fact, it almost came to blows several times. They had to have a police presence there. In my thinking, if that's your approach, you're more interested in antagonism and kicking the beehive than you are learning to work with a culture and to communicate truth within their culture in ways that can be heard and possibly be persuasive.
Right. So even if your goal is persuasion, it's not even an effective method, right? I mean, it's not
right.
It's almost like, you know, when you say that, you know what the response is. Like you say, kicking the beehive. You know exactly what's going to happen. The bees are going to come out. Versus,
right.
I don't know, like a beekeeper that knows how to handle it. Or
right. Exactly.
So here's a question. I mean, you know, I guess this person might feel an urgency sometimes when they just meet somebody on the street, you know? It sounds like you build a lot of relationships over time with people of different faiths, but how does one approach meetings where there may be one time in a life that you see someone, say you meet someone taking an Uber or a Lyft, and you might have a chance to talk about Jesus? Have you ever thought about that kind of thing versus more the long time relationship?
I don't know how effective. I mean, I think part of what's going on here, the dynamic many of us evangelicals have, is because we're so focused on afterlife issues, rather than living out the kingdom of God in the here and now, which also counts towards investment in the afterlife. We tend to put all the eggs in the basket of, we've got to preach, it's urgent, it's heaven or hell kind of thing. And therefore, if I'm in this Uber situation, I've got to get this message out. If it comes naturally in a conversation, perhaps, and it seems like you've got an interested Uber driver, I would say go for it. But if you're just sitting there getting ready to pay your bill and offer the tip, and you say, by the way, Jesus loves you and I don't want you to go to hell, I don't know. I think that does more for you feeling like you've done something and checked off a box then it really does something meaningfully for the other individual. But that would be my take. I think others might disagree.
Yeah, oh, that's interesting, because I've had moments where I felt compelled to be in an Uber and just bring up Jesus stuff, and it came natural. And
Yeah.
it could be also just depends on the kind of person, right? I mean, that the way you build relationship, you're just really good at bringing stuff up, or like
Yeah.
you're the kind of guy that knows how to bring up politics and it doesn't become an argument. What do you think about this? What do you think about Jesus?
Well, and it has come up for me on occasion. I before the pandemic, I used to go to conferences and this kind of thing, and I have I think one of the last ones I did was a conference with Muslims and Christians on Islamophobia, and I was taking an Uber to the airport from the church location where it was being held, and they always ask, where are you from? What are you doing here? And you share, and they're intrigued by that. And it's a natural part of the conversation. I think that kind of context is fine. But if it appears forced, again, simply because you're concerned about checking off a theological box, then I think it becomes more problematic.
Sure. And I've had that done to me too. So I know, I always think about do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Right.
If it wouldn't translate from the other side, think about what, but on
Well,
that.
I mean, if you've ever walked down the street by a street preacher, people have no idea what my spiritual convictions are, and I walk by and they're preaching at me like I'm one breath away from hell. They don't know me from Adam. My reaction is not, gosh, what a great message, I need to pause and listen more. It's like it's upsetting. It's you don't know me. I'm simply an object that you're trying to preach at. So we need to be sensitive to how, if we feel that way in some context, how might others feel as well?
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that was talked about last night is God can use anything. God could use a street preacher in someone's life. Doesn't mean though that's the most effective method. Just because that was used as to get someone thinking, doesn't mean that they're the best example to follow.
Yeah, I mean, a phrase I like to use is God used Balaam's ass, but that doesn't mean we should be asses in the proclamation of the gospel. So
that's a good one. I like that. What type of people would you give up on and just walk away from, and why? And maybe another way of saying it is, like, I think about the Bible passage where Jesus sends out this 72, the 70, different versions of the gospel say 70, 72. And he sends them out, and then he says, there's times where you should just shake off the dust, and if they don't show hospitality to you, and you just kind of go on your way and just kind of, all right, these people aren't going to be receptive to what I have to say. So are there times where you have experienced that, or how do you discern that?
Yeah, not so much in person, but certainly online contacts. Facebook, I would say social media is a pretty poor context in which to engage in these kinds of things. But I do at times try and, as I post things, have conversations with people, and you can get a feeling pretty quick as to whether or not they have honest concerns and objections, or whether or not they're coming across as confrontational and belittling. And I just quickly wrap up and say, I appreciate the conversation and the opportunity, but I really prefer to invest my time in people who really want to ask honest questions and be self-critical and engage in mutually listening, and then just kind of break it off. There's very little time that we all have, and you kind of get a feel for whether or not there are good conversation possibilities there.
Yeah. And I mean, on that note, okay, so let me press a little bit there, right? Because
sure.
This one question is, what are some tips to love your enemy? Because it's hard to do. But also, I mean, that person at that point is your enemy, right? And do you ever feel a calling to kind of press in to keep going in trying to, to engage someone that doesn't really want to engage? I don't know. I mean,
yeah, I don't know that person. I wouldn't necessarily view that person as my enemy. I think it's interesting. It would make for an interesting conversation with Christians is, how do you identify somebody as the enemy? That's kind of a concerning question, I think. It's somebody that I obviously have strong disagreements with on a Facebook comment. They don't seem like they're interested in a good, respectful conversation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're my enemy. I just think we're in a culture right now that we're so quick to write people off that we disagree with on right and left, that if you disagree with me over some foundational and important political or religious ideas, it's not because we have an honest disagreement. It's not because we have differences of opinion or see things differently. It's because you're deficient, you're uneducated, you might even be evil, you might be racist or what have you. And who knows, maybe some of those things are true, but that's the default set of assumptions about those that we disagree with. How can we move to a place where we give others that we have strong differences with the benefit of the doubt, that we just disagree with each other, and the only way we're going to find out why, maybe studies show that we actually agree with those on the other side of the aisle more than we think that we do. And so it's really a set of inappropriate assumptions that we bring to the table. So how can we check those assumptions, give them the benefit of the doubt, have the conversation, and really clarify where we disagree? And once we figure that out, okay, how are we going to work through the process, even though we do have these disagreements? But if we start out with the assumption that everybody that I have strong disagreements with is anti-God, the enemy of God, my enemy, and therefore I've got to view them as the enemy, I think that raises a whole host of problems for not only for us, but for the church and the culture that we live in.
And that's that could be its own hour discussion, because especially in this climate of and it's a tension. I mean, I don't think this is going to be the end of that conversation about how do you think about extreme complex disagreements. Well, let me
right. Well, think about it. Let's just really quickly here add some specifics to that. Who's the enemy? The enemy today is Republicans. The enemy is Nazis and those kind. And we just want to write those people off. I don't think we ought to be writing Nazis or KKK members or anybody off. There are reasons why people come to the prejudices that they hold. And there are stories of people who've come out of those kinds of things. And it was because if you look at the research that's been done, it's not because they were shamed or vilified. It's because somebody extended empathy to them when they didn't deserve empathy and forgiveness. That's the kind of people we're supposed to be as Christians. So if we view them as enemies, how can we love them as enemies, even in spite of the prejudices and all that goes with it? Because that's what holds transformative power, not simply writing people off.
Right. Well, and maybe to add to this, I don't know if this is necessarily disagreeing with you, or maybe adding, I think about maybe the Pharisees is an example of people that were going in the wrong direction. And Jesus entered into their lives, and he did speak some harsh words, whitewashed tombs. But you see in the book of Acts, some of them actually began to follow Jesus, but he did enter into, I think sometimes when we look at the episodes in the Gospels, we assume Jesus just was the enemy of the Pharisees, as if he didn't love them. And if he wasn't like interacting with them, and he would go to some of them, there's homes to eat dinner, right? So, you can imagine that phrase, "Oh, you whitewashed tomb," like that one phrase that's speaking the truth about where they were, and imagine it as this kind of yelling at them and like, "Oh, you guys are, like just trying to cut off relationships."
Yeah. And the context there is important. I see sometimes Christians cite that and use it as an example for multi-faith conversations. And that's an inappropriate set of passages to use. That was an in-house debate. Jesus is denouncing religious leaders within his own Judaism for those who were the custodians of the faith, who should have known better and recognized Messiah in their midst. The example for us is not that, it's rather Jesus in his engagement with Gentiles and Samaritans when he goes outside of the household of his faith. And when we look at those kinds of passages, we see a very different kind of approach. For example, Jesus with the Samaritan woman and those kinds of things. So we have to be very careful that we're picking up the right text and right context.
This would be a great whole Bible study, right? Even just to go and think about, because that was part of the conversation we had after you left last night about kind of the prophetic word towards the household of faith, and then the evangelistic posture towards those who are outside. So this is kind of definitely connecting with that, what you're saying. And I think we definitely need to explore that. I'm hoping that as we go back to the scriptures and we read the Gospels and things like that it sparks our thinking about, well, what category are these people in? And one last question. I know you have to leave in a couple of minutes, but
yep.
What are some things that you have learned from people of other religions, other faiths, other perspectives that you believe have corrected your own understanding or changed your own way of thinking or believing or being or doing as a follower of Jesus?
Yeah, I wouldn't say corrected, but I will say there's this principle called holy envy. Christopher Stendhal was involved in interfaith dialogue, and he developed this concept. He said, if you really want to appreciate somebody in another religious tradition, you have to get to the point where you can have holy envy. That is, there's something in their religious tradition that you really emphasize, and you wish that you could find more in yours. So, for example, I disagree with Mormonism. However, I do appreciate, for example, the work that they do on behalf of the dead. They have their temple work. I don't think we should be doing temple work for the dead. However, I do think there is a greater place in Western Christianity for an appreciation of those who have passed before us. I think in the West, death is very clean and sanitized, and we go to a funeral and then we just kind of move on. I think Mormonism has a stronger sense of connection to the dead, to ancestors, to family. And I think those kinds of things in another religious tradition can make us look back at our own tradition by way of reflection and say, I've got holy envy for that. I appreciate it. And it doesn't correct my understanding. I'm not grabbing an element of their tradition and putting it into mine and creating a syncretism, but it's causing me to go back and reflect more on my own tradition to maybe emphasize something that I should have been emphasizing previously. So those are the kinds of things we can look at.
Yeah, and I've noticed, I mean, to your point, I think Eastern Orthodox and a lot of Eastern Christians
Right.
actually very strongly emphasize kind of those who have gone before us. I mean, emphasizing them as actually alive, right? In the presence of the Lord as kind of our mentors in the faith. We had
Yeah, the Roman Catholic tradition as well. Yes.
yeah. So, I mean, but would you have, is there ever something that, is there something that ever is like an open question that makes you think, I don't know, this is actually making a question like dialoguing with other religions, I would imagine, some of it could confirm to you, yeah, Jesus is Lord. Like I more and more than ever believe that our faith is, the way, and but I could also see it kind of making you ask questions like, "What? Are we really right?" I mean, so have you ever?
And there's nothing, I've never had experienced that, but there's nothing wrong with asking yourself the question. I think also one of the weaknesses of our church system is that we don't value and nurture doubt. We've got to have absolute assurance, and there's confidence on the one hand in your faith, but it's okay to have doubt. And the worst thing you could do with a doubt is to suppress it and not follow it and do the things that you need to do to take care of that doubt, which means asking more questions, going deeper into your tradition, seeking out those who might provide you with wise counsel. And that can happen in a multi-faith kind of conversation where questions arise and you have to go back and dig into your own tradition. And again, the statistics indicate that most of the time in interfaith dialogue, people end up with a stronger faith conviction rather than losing it, even though at times that does happen. So again, it goes back to the whole risk question.
Yeah. Well, there's so much. I pray that we can all continue to grow in these skills by the Holy Spirit and learn to have the kind of doubt that is healthy, not the kind of doubt that, James says you should have faith, not doubt, like not that kind of doubt, but the kind of doubt that really causes us to ask ourselves, are we really following Jesus in his way of self-giving love for our enemies and listening to them well. So John, thanks again. I really do pray that, I really hope that this conversation can allow others to connect and even learn from the kind of things that you're doing. But yeah, again, thanks so much for this time.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. Appreciate it.